Conspiracy. Hello! Hello and welcome! It is Monday, November 3rd, 2008. November? My goodness, how did it get to be November? This is WFTL Bytes, your occasiodaily FOSS and Linux news show with your host, me, Marcel Gagné. I was just saying the word conspiracy over and over again, because there's a little bit of conspiracy in today's newscast, and before I do that, I'm going to put on my press hat. And my press hat is a tinfoil band. That's to block the incoming waves of conspiracy that might be trying to get into my brain. So now I can report officially on the stories of today. I want to tell you about a blog, a Linux blog. In fact, it's kind of a strange Linux blog because it's a Linux blog that hates Linux, apparently. Or so the blog would have you believe by its title. It's called the Linux Haters blog. And the most interesting thing about the Linux Haters blog today, and the reason I mention it, is that it's dead. No, that's not right. Yes, it is. Actually, the Linux Haters blog is actually dead, but the Linux Haters blog is interesting, or has been interesting, because it's done by a guy who is, very sharp, very funny, foul-mouthed, nasty, horrible, really cool when it comes to his discussions of Linux and open source and so forth. It's fascinating in the sense that the guy has spent an incredible amount of energy and time, and I'm going to say guy, it could be a woman, nobody knows who the Linux hater is. It's probably one of the people that I'm going to be talking about later on today. I'm going to name them and then you can guess for yourself. But it's always been informative because this person, for whatever reason, I mean, his blog says you should hate Linux, or, why you should hate Linux. Well, it's fascinating that a guy who hates Linux so much, or a gal who hates Linux so much, should spend so much time, A, talking about it, B, learning all the ins and outs of it, because this is somebody who knows Linux, or who has known Linux intimately, and is able to talk about it intelligently. Anyway, this week they decided to sign off, and it's going to be a shame because it was actually quite entertaining if you could get past the foul-mouthed language and, nastiness aimed at Linux. Interestingly enough, the comment sections were titled Flames. That should tell you something. One of the guys who actually commented on this a couple months back is a guy named Jeremy Allison. Jeremy Allison, by the way, is one of the Samba lead developers, and he actually thought that the Linux hater was actually a Linux lover, a guy who so incredibly loved Linux that he was willing to beat it up, to give it a 1-2 punch, to roll it around on the ground and grab it by the neck and strangle it a little bit and say, "Fix me!" Well, that was his idea anyway. Basically, just bring to light all the faults associated with Linux, and that way it would be made into a better, kinder, gentler, more powerful product. However you want to read that. Anyway, oh, by the way, the links are at the bottom. You'll be happy to find that out. And because a good idea should never be allowed to die, perhaps it should be, but some people aren't willing to let it die, there is now a Linux Haters Redux. Yes, some person has decided that since the Linux hater has signed off, they should sign on as the Redux and basically, well, take all the good ideas that the person had before and, try to be the new Linux hater. So there you go. Links are there. You can check it out if you want. Speaking of blogs and conspiracies, Stephen J. Von Nichols, writing over at Computer World, is talking about Microsoft, and this is where the conspiracy this time rolls around. Microsoft just recently had a big to-do where they were talking about their new Windows 7, or Vista Reloaded, or whatever you want to call it. I know, it's something entirely new, better, faster, stronger. Anyhow, where they handed out a whole bunch of notebooks. Stephen J. calls these bribes. The notebooks, by the way, were Dell XPSs with a 2.4 gigahertz Core 2 Duo, 3 gigabytes of RAM, preloaded with Windows 7 so that the bloggers could write nice things about it. Well, Stephen J. Von Nichols says this is bribery, and it doesn't make for very honest reporting. You can go and check that out yourself as well. In other news, the GNOME Foundation has gotten a couple of high-powered backers. Yes, Motorola and Google have joined the GNOME Foundation. The GNOME Foundation, by the way, is, and I quote, a member-directed nonprofit organization that provides financial, organizational, and legal support to the GNOME project and helps determine its vision and roadmap. So there you go. A couple of high-powered helpers for the GNOME Foundation. Yes, I have a cold. Linux Today, Carla Schroeder, writing over at Linux Today, asks whether Linux can deliver for small business or for business in general. And she answers with a qualified yes. It turns out, she says, that giving somebody a Linux CD and saying, here's a Linux CD, install it, dump Windows and start running Linux, and then walking away is probably not a good way to get people to actually start using Linux and keep using Linux. She says that, yes, Linux is probably the best choice in 99% of the cases when it comes to deploying some kind of a IT business infrastructure solution. However, you have to have a couple of wonderful things associated with it, and one of them is you have to have what did she put it? Visibility. In other words, Linux has to be visible. The people behind it have to be visible. People have to know what they're running and have to believe that there's something behind you helping you. And of course, what it also needs is friendly, reliable support. Imagine that. It means that we need people out there, lots and lots of people who are capable of supporting Linux in a big way, including Joe the plumber. It's an election thing, what can I tell you? Anyway, nobody's going to remember that next week. Okay, finally, I also want to point out that the third annual Open Source CMS Awards. CMS, of course, is Content Management Systems. Are there any non-open source content management systems? Any worth mentioning? Doesn't really matter. Anyway, the third annual of these awards, run by Pact, who puts forth $20,000 in cold hard cash to the award winners, has announced its winner for 2008. And, drum roll, it's Drupal. Yes, it was Drupal last year, it's Drupal this year. Second was Joomla, and third was .NET Nuke. Now, interestingly enough, they had a couple of other categories, which I want to mention, just because they are really that interesting. One of them was, are you ready for this? Was the most promising CMS, and that went to Silverstripe. And here's the other one, the best non-PHP CMS system. I didn't know there were any non-PHP CMS systems these days. Well, as it turns out, that award went to Plone. And I'm going to wrap it up with that, and I think that I was able to keep a clear head and keep all the conspiracy waves out of my brain, and thanks for joining me. WFTL Bytes, WFTL Bytes.com. I'm done. That's it. I'm finished. Bye. Whew. Oh, coffee. Yes, coffee. No, really, I am actually done. It's over.